And we're back to the metaphorical roundtable. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Nathan Foster, along with my good buddy, Caleb Now. Caleb, how are you doing, sir?
Man, I'm making it. Surviving COVID. That's what it's all about right now. And this.
I was about to say. So, 4 guys in the studio today, 0 positive cases amongst the 4 of us, right?
Well, good.
That we know of.
Yeah, well, it'd be awesome. So Caleb and I were talking about this. This is episode 10. We've been doing this for a year. This is officially a year. A year ago, we sat down, 4 young, naive youth ministers, talked for 3 hours about self-defense and college football, and we realized that was way too long.
Lesson learned.
But, yeah, we're getting better at this, though.
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought it would be fun to invite back one of those youth ministers that was with us. Landon Moore is back with us, first returning guest.
Yo.
Totally planned.
Absolutely. I've known about this for weeks.
Yeah.
So Landon was gracious enough to join us short notice. We had a cancellation due to family emergency. And so Landon is here because he clearly has nothing better to do with his life. But we're appreciative of it. And then another guest, brand new to the show, Mr. Kerry Williams, preacher extraordinaire. Preacher here at West Main, works with me. Excited to have you on. You got thrown in a really interesting time. We talked about it. We had 3 weeks before we shut down with COVID. So he's relatively. I don't know if I should call you new. It feels
know, 7 months new. That's
right.
Can you
7 months,
7
but
months?
it feels like 7 years, right? With the amount of stuff that's gone into this last little bit. But anyway. We're excited that you guys are listening. For all of those that are out there listening, shout out to Chase Cyril, who's probably asleep right now. Baby girl was born at like 12:20 or something like that this morning. So he's got a brand new baby girl at home. Congratulations to him. But this is episode 10. We officially hit double digits. We've missed a couple episodes in there. COVID threw a wrench in some things. Caleb tried to die. Not related. Those two things. Those 2 things were not related. But Caleb had to spend. How long were you in the hospital? A week?
I think it's 2 full weeks.
2 full weeks in the
full
hospital,
weeks,
man.
So.
But anyway, we're excited to bring this to you. Today's topic is first century versus 21st century Christians. And we were excited about this topic. We wanted to talk about this partially because, I'm going to throw this out here. I feel like when it comes to first century versus 21st century Christians, we do one of 2 things. Either one, we throw Bible characters, we view them as that. We view them as characters, and we put all of these stories into this place that we like to call like Bible storyland. It was a fictional place where all these nifty stories and characters existed. Or we over-romanticize the idea of Christians in the first century being mega Christians. And part of that, I think, is because of the miraculous things that they were able to accomplish. You know, Moses parted the sea, Noah survived the destruction of the world, so on and so forth. So we kind of wanted to tackle that. What are some differences? What are some similarities? And what are your all initial thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest things is, as I was thinking about all this, is you think about us and how, of course, technology and all this mess, but if you think of just the basic of life and, we'll talk about cultural stuff first. In a lot of ways it was different, but it wasn't, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because like you talked about the Bible land and how we focus on people that they were just this little secluded Bible land people. But it's crazy to think about, and we'll get to the spiritual stuff later, but as far as the culture and spiritual together, for me, I think it's a lot of the same for us and them, and differences, and there was obviously differences because technology, all that mess. But I think that a lot of it was the same because, we'll get to the spiritual in a minute, but you think of the before Jesus, they were the same way we were because they hadn't seen Jesus. So, it was they've heard of Jesus. Of course, it was the old law then, but a lot of it was the same. minus culture.
Well,
That makes sense.
The cultural differences were vast, right?
Yeah.
You know, we don't have to offer sacrifice. What is it? There's I don't remember where it is. I had a youth minister that would use this. It was somewhere in like maybe Exodus or Leviticus, but it was the punishment for children that were disobedient to their parents got stoned. Like, thank goodness that's not the case anymore, right? That's pretty harsh. You talk about cultural differences.
Yeah, I'm sure some parents would disagree with you, but
Well, cultural differences, it kind of depends on who you're talking about in the first century, because a Jewish culture is very, very different than a pagan culture in Corinth or in Rome or any of those places. And so, you know, it's kind of intriguing to me because all of my life preaching, grew up in the churches of Christ, have always loved the restoration plea and the idea of just being Christians and Christians only. So I've heard from the pulpit from my dad and others years and years and years of, well, we just want to be the church of the first century. And it's intriguing because now everybody's freaking out because the 21st century looks more like the first century than the 20th century did. And what I mean by people's values, their philosophies, their morals, their virtues, the things that they find to be philosophically important, looks much more like what it did in the first century, in especially, maybe not the Jewish part of the first century, but in the pagan, Roman, Greek society. So it's kind of interesting. So, you know, we say we want to be the church of the first century. Maybe God answered our prayers and He gave us the 21st century, like the first century, to be able to do what we feel He wants us to be and to do. So.
Yeah. It's interesting how we like to respond to that too, right? And that's with a lot of stuff, but with that particular, it's like, we want this. God says, okay, here you go. We're like, whoa, not like that. You know, we have to, I don't know, we have a tendency to backpedal. I don't know.
Careful what you wish for.
Right.
That's right.
I think another thing it's a pretty big cultural difference is in relation to the kingdom itself, is that the church didn't really become an institution until the 4th century. Until Constantine decided he was going to become baptized and declare Christianity the state religion on his deathbed. And so I think there's some big cultural differences there. It wasn't particularly popular to be Christian in the 1st century. It's almost expected, especially in conservative American culture, that you're a believer of Jesus and that you're a believer in God. It is a cultural expectation for a lot of people in this country and a lot of people in other places around the world now. They would have been viewed as weirdos, and they would have been viewed as outcasts because of the way they chose to live. They created their own culture inside of a hostile culture for them, and we don't really face the same kind of hostility in our culture today. So I think that's a big difference as well.
I'm actually teaching, I teach different classes every term, and one of them I'm teaching right now is the culture world of Christianity, Greece and Rome. So we dive into those cultural dynamics. And what's super interesting about it is the Romans, one of the reasons they didn't like Christianity is they felt that we were immoral, which is shocking because they were super immoral by our standards. You know, they had the Temple of Diana and temple prostitutes and all that. But they just couldn't understand the language. So they thought we were cannibals, that we actually ate physical flesh and the blood of Jesus, and that just blew their mind. You know, the Lord's Supper to them was the most scandalous thing ever. And then we had these love feasts and fellowship, and they thought it was rank immorality. And it's just such a dynamic that a lot of folks don't understand about the way the Romans saw the church. They didn't see them. You know, we fall into persecution more and more and more in our culture today because people think we're too restrictive and we're too negative and we're too, well, they saw Christians as being just weird and out there and just out of their minds and immoral and debased, and it's just strange how that's totally opposite.
Yeah, not to mention things like Christians believed in the fun little thing of monogamy and like in raising children to be upstanding people and keeping a solid household and caring for people nobody else wanted to care for. and spending time around people who were very likely to make them sick and cause them to die. These were things that they were a people who were completely disinterested in self, and that made no sense to Roman and Greek cultures at all, because a lot like American culture today, for a lot of people, especially in Roman and Greek cultures, it was about, how am I going to advance next? Where am I going with this? How is this going to benefit me? And Christians bought into the idea, which, let's be honest, Jesus laid for them on the Sermon on the Mount, that it's not about you anymore.
No.
That you live, and your purpose is to the service and to the love of people who have nobody else to serve and to love them. And that made no sense to the popular culture of the day.
I mean, they were used, the Romans and the Greeks, they were used to Stoicism, they were used to Epicureanism, they were used to hedonism, and the Christian ideal didn't fit any of those.
Yeah.
And so it was like, this is so odd, but there's a lot of differences, no doubt.
Yeah, for sure. So, culture aside, what do you guys think were some of the most, I'm gonna say, most interesting, as far as like were there huge spiritual differences between a first century Christian and a 21st century Christian? And I think, my opinion, I think one of the things that we focus on the most as far as the spiritual differences go were the spiritual gifts, the miraculous powers, that we read about a lot in the New Testament. The apostles were able to do things that we can't do. And again, I think that feeds into this idea of us treating first century Christians, first century or Bible Christians as what we view them as super Christians, right? We don't view them as normal people who did miraculous things. We view them as miraculous people.
I think maybe they lived in such a way, at least the way the New Testament describes the first century church. They obviously weren't perfect. All you have to do is read the 7 letters to the 7 churches in Revelations to figure out that they
or First Corinthians,
or either one, that they weren't all perfect, right?
Right.
But when it talks about how they lived and how they loved, it almost seems like everything to the first century church was somewhat spiritual. Everything they did, everybody they came in contact with, was a moment of spirituality led by the Holy Spirit of God. And I think a difference between them and today is we've boxed in that there's a spiritual and there's a not spiritual. And it doesn't seem to me that the first century church really lived that way. They didn't really act that way. Everything was an opportunity to impart the Spirit of Christ onto the world. And maybe I think there are a lot of factors for that, right? I think turning church institutional made a difference in that.
Well, yeah, and I think that
there are a lot of things
that's like a spiritual and a cultural difference, right? Because I don't recall reading anywhere where that still isn't supposed to be the goal.
Correct.
Right. So as culture progressed in a certain direction, somewhere along the way we decided to start separating the spiritual from the secular. So I mean, I think it's a really good point.
That's really evident right now because we're in an election cycle, and there's never a time when Americans are more compartmentalizing different areas of their life than when an election cycle is going on, because then they feel they have to defend a candidate and that has indefensible character because of they agree with positions, and then or others feel they have to defend defendable positions based upon the character of one over the other. It's just and there's so many compromises made and excuses, and so and it's funny because people do compartmentalize it, but then they kind of still try to support based upon their own Christianity or whatever on this because I have to be a Christian. It's such a, I think it'll be something that podcasts 1,000 years from now look back on 21st century Christianity and say, man, that people were crazy political.
I agree 100%. Yeah.
It'll be interesting for sure. Not that I actually had a conversation with our secretary. I was like, we were talking about Y2K, and then all of a sudden it was like, what about 2100? Everybody's freaking out about 2000. What happens 20?
It'll happen again.
I was like, I don't anticipate being here to watch 2100.
Yeah.
So that's just me. But no, it brings a really good point, because especially, and you talk about political cycles always bringing that out. And so I guess we're doing this here in September, end of October, early November, or really all of October, you're going to start seeing, if you haven't already, all those posts about I'm a Christian and I have to vote for, and it's going to be, it's like that's clickbait, right? You know, you're going to see posts about my salvation isn't dictated by who's in the White House. Wes McAdams did a really good post about that a few years ago.
That was pretty good.
About that. But no, you're absolutely right, and we compartmentalize, and we're not supposed to. You know, we're not ever told to. And right now, it even makes it, I'm not gonna say worse, but it seems amplified, because you're in an election cycle. COVID has made it to where you're compartmentalizing your life based on school and work and worship, and you know, you want to keep your COVID, what's the word I'm looking for? Your COVID bubble, but exposure. That's your COVID exposure ring as small as possible, right? Yeah. So you're trying to compartmentalize parts of your life, and with so much going on, it's weird too, because you know the first century had their fair share of problems. You know, it's not as though we're just busier and therefore our focus breaks. You know, the first century had its own, you know, slew of issues that were going on outside of the church setting. Same is true today. You know, we've got so much going on, but it's that focus that we're supposed to have, but maybe sometimes, you know, maybe even often we fall short on figuring out that it's not compartments of our life. You know, it's our life, and all those pieces are supposed to kind of intermingle with each other.
Well, one of the things that it kind of goes along with what I said earlier, I feel like whether the kingdom today, the church today, I don't think they grasp the idea of total surrender like the first century church did. If you were going to choose Jesus in the first, second, third centuries, you had to really be dedicated to do it. It meant your life, and sometimes it came at the cost of your physical life. It was a decision that one had to make, that they said, from this moment and this moment forward, I'm choosing to choose Jesus in every compartment of my life from now on. They didn't have the luxury because of cultural issues, because of the hostile arena that they found themselves in, regardless of where they went.
Right.
They didn't have the luxury of saying, well, I'll put Jesus here, but I won't put him here.
Well,
I won't put him here.
And part of that, in my opinion, is in the first, second, third century, there was one definition of being a Christian. There's one definition of being a follower of Christ. Today, being a Christian is such a, when you talk about it from a broad spectrum, you know, American Christianity type view, there's so many different definitions of that. You know, I'm a Christian. What does that mean? You know,
loose
define
definition.
that. Yeah, right. You know, I'm a part of any type of, you know, as long as, and to some detriment, we as a culture have simplified and watered down the idea of being a Christian as I acknowledge Jesus Christ in an existence, and that's all we've really simplified it as.
Yeah, well, a lot of people want to have him like a light switch. You can turn him on and off. I mean, it's easy. It's easier in life to please people and things like that in today's society. To you know, turn Jesus off whenever we want to, or like you talk about compartmentalizing it. You know, society makes it easy to do that.
Linda's comment was intriguing to me about that people they were totally committed in the New Testament, and now we have this, you know, it's just a part of your life, a piece of the pie, whatever. But the interesting thing about that is that in the first century, they had some of those problems too, depending on the locale. Because, you know, in the 7 churches of Asia, one of y'all mentioned that, you have a church that had left their first love doctrinally. I mean, they're doing things right. They're kicking out false teachers, all of this. But he says, I have this against you. You've left your first love. So there was a complacency then. But the thing is that that environment of the first century, through the awesome blessing and tool of that we don't recognize anymore as a blessing and tool, which is suffering.
Yeah, 100%.
That, I mean, suffering makes us better.
Oh,
And suffering weeds out the wheat from the chaff. It always has. And we have a terrible theology of suffering in the current present day climate.
Absolutely.
It's terrible. I mean, in the New Testament, suffering wasn't a thing that when you come down forward, please ask the Lord to take it away from me.
Yeah.
No, Paul says, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection to share in his suffering. How about consider it pure joy when you face trials and temptations?
Yeah.
You ever heard anybody say, pure joy, Lord, thank you. I'm going through this,
Yeah.
Nobody does that. How about Sermon on the Mount? Jesus says, blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and speak all manner. I mean, they didn't see suffering like we do. They saw it as an opportunity to prove their love to God.
Yeah.
We just want it to be easy.
Yeah.
We just want it to be easy.
Well, I think to an extent, and that's part of the 21st century Christian, and I use that term loosely, a little bit, the modern day, what we consider a Christian culture. I think because we've wanted it so easy for so long, we've made it easy. Now, is that what true biblical Christianity is supposed to look like? No, right? We can all agree with that. But we've turned it into something that's simple, and it started little by little. And there was a point in our history, not that long ago, where it was, as long as you believe in Jesus and you go to church, right? That was you being a Christian.
Yeah.
Now, and COVID's made this even easier, right? Now, all you got to do is believe. You don't even, there's the idea of satellite campuses and I'm not, let me make this very clear. I'm not knocking the idea of home church specifically with what we've gone through over the last few months, right? I do think that there needs to be a concentrated effort to worship together again. But before COVID, even before COVID, you saw this idea of worshiping by myself was more and more and more accepted. And so the idea of a corporate worship service became almost unnecessary, even before COVID. This was something that was picking up steam 2018, 2019, and then COVID just kind of pushed it over the edge.
I would argue it's been picking up steam since the end of World War II, but probably more accurately Vietnam. But it's interesting that the first century church also didn't have, not that there weren't wealthy Christians in the first century, because there obviously were. They had to get things paid for and done by benefactors and by somebody. But again, I can't speak to the nature of the kingdom in other parts of the world, but I can hear the American church, and this is just as much a spiritual issue as it is a cultural one.
Right.
Rocks in a pile of its own wealth more often than not, and wealth makes things easy, because with wealth you can buy off persecution. You can buy freedom with wealth, and there are parts of the world where the church just doesn't have it. They have to depend on somebody else to take care of things for them. We don't. No. The American church doesn't, and it's interesting. Well, it's not interesting. It's pretty straightforward that throughout the New Testament, Jesus constantly says that this journey is not supposed to be easy for you.
No.
That people are going to hate you, and that's going to be your reality.
Yeah.
But because we live in a culture that believes in a plurality of ideas, that believes in freedom of religion, good things at heart,
right?
But it means that legally nobody can hurt you for believing anything. Nobody can force you to do anything. Nobody can, and it makes doing what we're called to and what we're supposed to be not almost, but way too easy.
So running with that for a second, and this is an opinion thing, because we've got differences and challenges. Do you think that from the first century to the 21st century, the church as a whole has lost a sense of urgency because of the cultural shift and there's really no detriment to whatever?
I would say that question needs to be a bit more specific. I think the question probably should be, has the American church lost its sense of urgency? Yeah. And I think that would be a yes. I think it's very likely that there are other places around the world who just don't have, who are constantly faced with the idea that I may lose my life because I believe this. I don't think that people in places like that, much like the church of the first century, they don't have the luxury of losing their urgency.
Yeah. Well, and the urgency can also be broken down into specific categories, right? So you've got your urgency in your personal faith, your urgency in, dealing with people that you're close to that are lost, and you feel a sense of urgency to help them or whatever it is. And you can take that however you go. But I do feel like there was a sense of urgency within the first century. What they were doing was serious. And, as we're still talking about differences, part of me tends to believe that we don't take Christianity as seriously as we once did. Does that make sense? And again, that all kind of boils back to the oversimplifying it and the compartmentalization. Like we don't view it as serious in nature. We just view it as, it's just there.
Well, the thing that's really burdensome to my heart about it is, we swing on a pendulum. Human beings have that tendency, and we as the church have done that dramatically. In my life, the church hasn't taught very much about the Holy Spirit because they were swinging on a pendulum from what they saw as a charismatic abuse of the Holy Spirit. So we just don't talk about it at all, kind of thing. And there's 100 examples like that. We don't believe in once saved, always saved, so we're going to teach almost once saved, barely saved, kind of thing. And to find that balance in that middle is very, very, very difficult. And so in the American church, we talk about this idea of complacency, and you mentioned wealth. And those are, I think the real problem is this sense of ease that still comes back to what do we really believe? And the thing is that I don't want to be someone who ignores the grace of God that's revealed. Oh, our God is not a angry God like that old Puritan sermon who wants to zap everybody. But at the other end, because we want to be grace-filled, which I do, that's the character of God. If we don't talk about the reality of eternity, both heaven and hell, then guess what? I'm never going to be motivated to bring people to Jesus so that they don't face that eternal consequence. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
And in the first century, they had an evangelism that was fervent because, life and death were more of a reality for them. Yeah. And they didn't want people to be lost. I just don't know how often we think about ourselves, but how much do we think about that girl who cut us off in traffic, or that person checking us out at the grocery store, or that, if the Bible's true, those people outside of Christ will be lost. And so that, it's funny because churches that are really hard about hell are often trying to preach hell to their own members to scare them into being right. But really we need to preach hell to our own members so that they'll help others not to go there, not worry about themselves because they're walking in the light. You understand what I mean? I don't know if I'm communicating what I'm trying to get across.
Yeah, no, that kind of goes back to what Landon said I guess it was more than a few minutes ago now, but that sense of community that the first century church had that maybe we don't. And that sense of community is strange, and it's not. So with the first century, you had Corinth, you had Ephesus, and those were probably, I'm probably going to say this wrong, and y'all can correct me, that's fine, but Corinth and Ephesus were arguably two of the closest major churches at the time, and they were 200 miles apart. Here in Tupelo there's 15 churches. So, and for some reason, we're all supposed to be part of the same community, and I'm not knocking that about Tupelo. You can look at Florence, Alabama has 57. Yeah,
39 in the city limits.
I say it's ridiculous. So, but there's supposed to be a sense of community there that maybe we separate. And I don't want to get too carried away harping on the differences, because I think that there are some differences that are probably beneficial too. There's, when you talk about cultural differences, we are living in a time now where it's easier to reach people than it ever has been, as far as putting content out there and trying to build relationships. But you also want to talk about the similarities, because I think we get carried away in how we're so much drastically different than the first church, and when you the first century church, and when you look at from a cultural spiritual challenge standpoint, we're a lot more similar than I think we are ready to give ourselves credit for, both in the positive and in the negative. So you take a look at 1 Corinthians, for example. I don't know if I say that there are plenty of 21st century churches that are dealing with inner divisions, that are dealing with problems with sexual misconduct and abusing, corporate worship structure. And so there's a lot of similarities that can be found in good and bad. I do think there's a portion of the church that still does try to really focus on evangelism and bringing people in. And I think that there are redeeming qualities amongst all churches that you can find. But I think that there are some similarities between the first century and the 21st century. I think we're more alike than we generally like to give credit for.
Well, you mentioned about this concept that we try to be evangelistic, and some people are still focused on that, but many aren't. And what's intriguing to me is that in the first century, the process went like this, nothing like what we preach, because we need to go and preach the gospel to everybody. So if I make a podcast, then I've done my job. If it tells people what they need, if I give them a track, then I've done my job. But that's not the process in the New Testament. It was about community.
That's right.
Go ye therefore into all the world and make disciples, baptizing them. So the process of evangelism is a process of a disciple making.
Right.
And that means relationships. That means community.
Yeah.
That means mentoring and friendship.
Right.
And there's as much evangelism done playing. My son and I, we play Magic the Gathering. I don't know if y'all know what that is, but we have played that game since he was like 8, and we love it. And everywhere we've lived, he would get some of his high school buddies, and they'd come over and we'd play. And I've actually had some great friendships with some of these young men, even though I'm the old guy and sometimes I'm playing after church in my suit. But I remember one time it was so meaningful because one boy had his girlfriend break up with him, and she started going out with a freshman, and he was a senior. It was like the worst thing that could ever happen, And so just to lighten the mood, I just made up something stupid about love is like an ice cream. It's really tasty in the beginning, but then it starts to warm up and then it melts, and you can put it back in the freezer and you can revive it a little bit, but it'll never look exactly. I was just being stupid. And then about 2 months later, Seth calls me. I'm at the office. He'd gotten home from school. He said, "Dad, can we play Magic tonight?" And I said, "Well, I guess so." He said, "Yeah, Joe, he asked if we could because, our other friend, he's going through a breakup and he figured he probably needed your ice cream."
That's awesome.
And I felt great. And I didn't really have a Bible study with these boys, but we moved away. But had I stayed there, I think it would have been something we could have been open about, because it starts with community and relationship,
Yeah, it does. Well, and you talk about cultural and spiritual similarities. The one that pops into my mind from the first century to the second century is when it comes to the church. In the first century, everybody had this idea of what the church was. Correct or incorrect, they had a conception of what the church was, whether they thought we were cannibals versus, whatever it was. The same is true today. I think people enter and have this idea of preconceived notion of what the church is, what Christians, loose term, what Christians are. And I don't think it's, in some cases it may be, but in more cases than not, I don't think it's completely accurate. And a part of that is the society and how the general religious population has treated specific groups of people, or however it is. In fact, Carrie we were telling a story the other day about your wife working at Arkansas State, and she worked with a openly homosexual student, and that student said, "I never would have guessed you were a Christian because you're always just so nice to me." knowing, my sexual, and I'm
which is so sad to hear that.
It just
right.
broke my heart.
Horrible.
Man, that's
And when Lenora was telling me this, I was getting ready to rebuke her because I'm like, everybody should know you're a Christian, But,
then you
the problem is
she was.
his definition of Christian wasn't
was that
our
terrible?
definition.
Yeah.
In other words, he saw Christians as mean and hard, and
Yeah.
and in that conversation, he said, "So, Miss Lenora, you think my lifestyle's not right?" And she said, "Yeah." He said, "But you've been so nice to me." And she said, "It's because I love you."
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, why do you think that?" And they had a great conversation.
Yeah.
That he'd grown up in Arkansas, knew Christians on every corner, and he had never had a real conversation about it.
So I mean,
because
like
he perceived that they didn't love him.
and part of that, it really is, and so that's when you talk about the similarities, especially within challenges. I think people approach the church with preconceived notions, and part of that, even in the first century and now, part of those have been merited to some extent, right? There's a lot of merit into his story of interacting with a number of people who called themselves Christians who didn't adopt the mentality of Christ. And so I think that's a very clear challenge that was placed by the first century as well as the 21st century, having to walk into nearly every conversation you have with somebody. They have a different definition of what a Christian is supposed to be. They have a different assumptions of what your beliefs already are, just based on where you worship, right? Based on whether or not I claim to be a Church of Christ, Methodist, Catholic, Baptist, Presbyterian, Mormon, whatever it is, you enter a conversation with assumptions. And I don't think that's ever changed.
Yeah, no, you're right. And that kind of feeds into the spiritual a little bit. I mean, I think there's some obvious cultural similarities. Immorality is immorality, and that was just as evident in the first century as it is now. Some of it doesn't even look any different. Some of it does, but I think they had to fight spiritual and doctrinal battles just like we do today. That was evident. Now, I'm going to go on record saying that at least the battles that they have recorded, some of them, most of them in the New Testament, at least some of them were worth fighting, like whether Christ is divine or not, and things like that. But I think, but to think that they didn't fight about stupid stuff is ridiculous. Just like the church fights with each other about ridiculous things today.
Yeah. I mean, 1 Corinthians is probably, and I always go back to 1 Corinthians because that's one of the, I think it's just one of the perfect examples. Paul addresses the church at Corinth there and does it pretty bluntly and somewhat. It's like if you want to read it this way, he does it somewhat sarcastically, when he's talking about the divisions, like how petty of a squabble is it that you want to listen to me or Apollos or Cephas or I'm like,
it's just Jesus,
right?
Yeah,
and he's like, what did you say about Paul's letter to Corinth? The Corinthians is like writing how to deal with people that you'd rather
maturely that you'd rather choke. Yeah.
I mean
that's what the book
is.
Is.
So true.
Yeah.
That's
so
true.
To think that. And the immorality, and that's what I've even heard people say that, immorality is more accepted now than it was in the first century. I'm like, it really wasn't.
No.
Morality and immorality have been an issue, always will be an issue, and they were.
The difference is the prevailing thought, prevailing human behavior at the time was that which we see as immoral now, that the majority of the world, considering themselves Christian, would see as typically immoral. Most of the world at the time probably wouldn't have seen that as immoral. And so there is a difference there, is that the perception of what is immoral and moral was slightly different at the time than it is now. But because we claim to follow the same Christ that the first century church did, that which is immoral isn't immoral now just because it's 2,100 years later. But yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, and that's what like I said, when I read 1 Corinthians, some of it is really, I'm not going to say hysterical, but it's it baffles me. So like when Paul addresses the idea of the sexual misconduct that's going on, he's like, there's sexual morality among you. It's like some of which is not even accepted by the Gentiles. He's like, you're doing something that's so bad, immoral people don't think you should be doing that. And so we read these things and we're like,
which leads you to speculate, and then you really wish.
Well, you don't have to speculate. I mean, it tells you exactly what's going on there. It's like. One of you is we'll leave that one alone, but you can go look it up later if you want. But it's one of those things that it's I don't know. I don't know. I'm losing my words here.
Landon had mentioned something about that. You would hope that the arguments in the New Testament weren't about the silly things people still argue about, and that I try to take a glass half full kind of approach to things. So yes, brethren can be petty, but hey, that's why they need me and they need you guys. I mean, when the church is mature, they wouldn't need leaders anymore. So, it's a way of looking at it. But the thing is about it is in the New Testament, talking about culture, and this does wrap around to what we're saying, people can't relate to it sometimes because they just don't even make the effort to try to read it from the first century mind. Like, for instance, you talk about petty versus real arguments. What I have found in the church is most of the things people argue about, I would categorize as opinion, but in every single circumstance, one of the people thinks it's an opinion and the other one thinks it's more than an opinion. Every single time, whether you're talking about kitchen in the building or you're talking about whatever it may be. And that's exactly what was true in the first century too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you look in Romans 14 and 15, there's two issues there. One is they're still having feast days and all that, but the big one was eating meats sacrificed to idols. For several years I preached up in Michigan. And if you don't know this, Dearborn, Michigan has the largest group of Muslims in the United States. And that's because, this is an interesting piece of trivia, Ford was an anti-Semite. He hated Jews. In fact, Adolf Hitler saw him as a hero. So Henry Ford hired a whole bunch
That's a good legacy.
of Arabs because he wanted to stick it to General Motors, who had hired a bunch of Jews to stick it to him. So it was like this corporate espionage stuff, So, but today, Dearborn is filled with mosques and, the street signs in Arabic. Well, I'm actually teaching a class on Romans 14 and 15. I had two elders in this class. And I said, I'm just going to ask you a question. Let's say you could drive the 20 minutes to Dearborn and there was a market outside of one of the mosques that had grade A ribeyes for 49 cents a pound. But you knew the money went to the Muslims, to their mosque. Who would buy it? About half the group raised their hand, including one of the elders. I said, who would absolutely not? Half the group raised their hand, including one of the elders. And I love this. That elder turned around and looked at the other elder and said, it's a good thing that's not the case, or you and I would be having a conversation. I mean, they were laughing about it, but they had serious disagreement about it. That's exactly what happened in the first century. Some people wouldn't buy that meat because that meat had been sacrificed to a pagan idol, and that money went to the temple. And we have people who won't give money to the Salvation Army, right? It's exactly the same thing. And to one of them, it was doctrine. To the other one, it was opinion. And Paul wades into that. But all my life, I've very seldom seen brethren actually use Romans 14 and 15 to deal with issues. Because we just don't read it with their mind, with their context. And see, it applies more than we think it does.
For sure. Well, let me ask you guys this, because we've talked about differences and similarities between the first century and the 21st century. So I want to get your guys' opinions on a few of these questions that we've got. So, have the goals changed from the first century to the 21st? And I'm going to leave it fairly vague that way. Have the goals from the first century church to the 21st century church, have they changed?
Yes and no.
Let's say. Not should they have changed, but have they? Have they
I
changed?
still think the answer is yes and no.
Yeah.
I think.
I love vague questions.
I think great. It's really fun to present students with vague questions. So do I think the core of the mission that Christ set us out on, the goals that He set before us of what it means to be a follower of Him, have those changed inherently? No, I don't think so. But over time, motivations change, and if you give it enough time, those motivations will end up changing the goals. And so, do I think that the church does some things to reach an end for different reasons now than they used to? Yeah. And sometimes does that alter what the goal actually is? Yes. And I think a lot of that's due to culture and spiritual differences that we have between then and now. But I think the simple answer is yes.
Yeah.
The goals have changed, but no,
Yeah.
the goals haven't changed.
I think it's totally dependent upon individual Christians and individual congregations.
I think that's also true. Yeah.
It has to be. It's really funny because Caleb loves it when we have more than one guest because it means he doesn't have to talk that much.
Oh, man, I'm just soaking in all this wisdom over here.
This is like Caleb said like maybe 2 words this whole time.
Man, I'm just letting him run with it.
So yeah, I agree. I think it has to be yes and no as far as your goals changing, and there's difference, right? We approach cultural goals differently, and I think and there's a difference in set of goals, right? So like the church's goal, there's a main eternal goal, and then there's goals. So like how many churches sit down and go, all right, these are the goals we want to reach in 1 year or 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is.
Right, yeah.
And those types of goals change all the time. So I mean, yes, they obviously change. The first century had goals that they wanted for their church. We have goals we want for our church, but the overall goal, I think, has stayed the same, and I think it has to stay the same, right? I mean, you can't. I think if you change the ultimate goal, you're no longer the church. Does that make sense?
Well, but I'm and y'all may disagree with me on this, but
yes,
I think maybe the first century church would have viewed the ultimate goal as slightly different than now. I don't think the ultimate goal for the first century church was heaven. I think the ultimate goal for the first century church was to live as Christ called them to live and to love.
And here's the difference, right?
And I think, I
say difference. It's not a difference. I've gone on record multiple times here saying this. I think we, as the American cultural church, have changed the goal into something that it's not. Because I've gone on record multiple times here saying your main goal is not to get to heaven. Your main goal as a Christian is to live as close to Christ as you possibly can. It's heaven is the result of that, right? And we want heaven, right? We have no problem saying that, but heaven is not supposed to be the end all be all goal. It's to live as Christ.
Well, it's to bring a little bit of heaven into the now, right? It's to live in such a way that the world sees a glimpse of what eternity looks like through you in this finite period of life. And I feel like the American church is so obsessed with getting this part over with so we can get to that next part, when the first century church thought, well, that next part can come tomorrow, so I'm going to live with
Kenny Chesney would disagree with you, but that may be it.
Getting this part over with, but stretching it out as long as we possibly can.
Yeah. And I've heard different mentalities on that too. So I've heard different mentalities on that specifically, right? Some people want to live here because they like it, they're comfortable, they don't feel comfortable addressing the idea of death. And I've heard some Christians openly embrace the idea of not wanting this life to be over because they still feel like there's work to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think
there can be some unhealthy motivations behind saying that, because some people who say, well, there's still more work I have to do, it could be because they've been taught a really cheap version of the grace of God, or it could mean that they just love doing kingdom work, and they're just not ready to stop. But
I think this whole discussion, there's a danger, and I'm falling into it myself, even in some of the comments I've made, of forgetting that the things we read in the New Testament are the ideal because they were written by those inspired to those people to make them that way.
Right.
There are people in the pew. People are people. the plot of humanity stays the same, the props change.
Yeah,
You know,
I agree.
so we have different props than
Yeah.
they did, but
Mhm.
the plot is people are no different than they've ever been. And so you understand what I'm getting at? So
Yeah.
Paul talks a high game of maturity and motivation.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But he's saying that because those readers needed to
Right.
grow in that.
Yeah.
And he'll tell, and he, you know, whether you think Paul wrote it or not, the Hebrew writer says in
Yeah.
Hebrews 5, you know, you should have been on solid meat now, but
You're still on milk.
you.
Right.
And what's really intriguing about that passage is he goes on and talks about you still need milk, and then he says we need to move past the elementary things.
Mhm.
We still have the same problem.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
one of the elementary teachings, and I'm as solid about the importance of baptism, essentiality of it as anybody, but I have seen churches where, you know, you have members who, I want that 5-step process
Mhm.
as the last 10 minutes of every lesson,
Yeah.
because it's not. But Paul mentioned, or the Hebrew writer, sorry, mentions there that, not to be inaccurate or impose my opinion. So the Hebrew writer says at the end of that section, he says, moving past the elementary things, and one of the things he mentions is the doctrine of baptism.
Mhm.
In other words, you should have this on straight and not have to just rehash it all the time. And he's not diminishing the importance of it.
Yeah.
He's saying you should work on to maturity. So they had that same issue
Yeah.
that we do. And that's why they wrote that
Yeah.
in the first place. I wonder if they were, I mean, where would we be in the scriptures if the church in the first century had fewer problems? You know, we would be devoid of a tremendous resource.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
So, I thought this was interesting too. So, because we talk about the differences but the similarities too, and I think one of the main. Well, I tell you what, we'll close that one at the very end. I want to ask you guys this: do you think that we over glorify biblical, and what I mean by that is Christians recorded for us in Scripture? Do you think we over glorify those Christians?
I think the answer to that is yes.
100%.
Yeah. Okay.
I think in I don't know if you might agree, but I think especially in our tradition, Paul gets put up on a pretty hefty pedestal. And not that he wasn't important; he was unbelievably important to the progress of the early church.
Right.
But you know, he's really important to especially to the Western Church for whatever reason.
And that's why we skip over Romans chapter 7,
Yeah.
because that's Paul pouring out his own weakness.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The things which
We
I
like
do
it.
are the things that I hate. The things which I do, and I practice the things that I hate. Who will deliver me from this body of
Right.
death? And I have heard lesson after lesson saying, well, he must be talking about his life before Christ.
Mhm.
No, because he had a perfect conscience
Yeah.
before he came
Yes,
to Christ,
did.
he says. So that has to be talking about now.
In the moment, right?
In the moment. But our theology doesn't fit that
No.
Yeah.
because we want to put people on a pedestal.
And we do that with a lot. Paul's a big one, but we do that with a lot of Christians. You know, we like to boast David out as a big example of, you know, well, he did wrong, but he was, you know, and we're like, you know, and I don't know, we do that with so many what we would consider biblical. We do it with David, with Moses, and like, you know, Moses and Noah. Like, when was the last time you ever heard a sermon about what happened to Noah after the ark? I mean, really. No, we just kind of gloss over that part, right? Noah built a boat. He did all this with faith, right?
Yeah, right.
You know, I've never heard. I haven't heard a sermon in the last 5 years on anything in the Song of Solomon. I mean, it's just so.
Well, I mean,
We pick and choose those that we feel are appropriate to over glorify. I think Peter's another one that we tend to over glorify.
But we're also not afraid to throw Peter under the bus either.
No,
he doesn't get this quite the same respect. And I think it's because of the denial. But
and that's that. When you talk about over glorifying biblical Christians, I think we do it at both ends of the spectrum, right? So we like to put people on pedestal, and we like to throw people under the bus.
Like poor
We
Thomas.
like to put Job on a pedestal.
Thomas, man.
We like to throw his wife under the bus. Thomas is the
Thomas
perfect
is the
example,
poster child for throwing
right?
under the bus.
You know, it's
So sorry for
there's just so many of the, like, you know, and I don't know. I think it's interesting how we treat, because we view them and I say them as first century Christians, we view them as so much different than we are, either from a character perspective or just I could never be on the same level as.
Well, they were supposed to be so perfect. Well, because they're in the Bible. They're supposed to be perfect. Well, then they tremble or they fall.
Right.
Oh man, look at these guys. They were supposed to be the holiest of the holies because they're in the Bible. Yeah. Oh man, look at
I think we gloss over the humanity of them.
Yes, exactly.
We don't view them as human people. We view them as special or, like I said, Bible story character land.
I would also say that Jesus deserves to be glorified above all else.
Well, yeah,
but I think obviously the divinity of Jesus is of utmost importance, but I think the most beautiful part of Jesus was his humanity. I think we forget the humanity.
The most relatable part.
Right, absolutely.
I think 100%. What made Jesus wasn't necessarily his divinity; it was his humanity. Well, that's
obviously Jesus is the only one that you consider a biblical Christian, first century Christian, that you look at and you go, okay, can't reach that.
Yeah,
we want to, right? And we strive to live like he would live, but he's the only one that there's a bar there that is actually unattainable.
Well, yes, but the point is that kind of like you were saying, for whatever reason we take. I mean, not just New Testament characters, but think of Jonah. Nobody ever talks about the fact that Jonah was a bigot. Okay, that he was an awful, nasty person, and God had to force him to do a good thing.
Right.
Okay. Nobody like I guess you'd say we PG everything, like what you said earlier, and it's because I think we actively erase the humanity out of these people.
Yeah.
Well, your next question on here, if you don't mind if I skip ahead.
Go for it.
To segue the two together.
Yeah.
But you said who has it worse, and I take it you mean first century Christians or us, and I would turn that over and say, who's living in a more important time?
Well, this is because we had this conversation a few weeks back, which I thought was really interesting.
And we've missed this boat completely. And that is, the New Testament is extremely clear, and the entire story of the Bible, that God has one objective. If you're asked the question, why did he knew he was going to have all this heartache? I mean, the only source of heartache that the Creator has ever had in his existence is people. Yeah, that's the only source of heartache. That's his only source of heartache, and he knew he would have it, and he made us anyway. So why? What's the big why? Well, I love Deuteronomy 8:1-2, because he talks about why did I lead you out of Egypt in the wilderness? And they're going to the promised land. Everything in the Old Testament is shadow, reflective of New Testament reality. Yeah. So promised land is heaven. Mm-hmm. That means wilderness is reflective of life. Mm-hmm. It's the hardship you got to pass through to get to the promised land. So what he's asking is, why did I let you live this hard life? Yeah. Everybody always asks, why does God let bad things happen? The answer's right there. Yeah. He says, to test you, to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. Now, it's about commandments, but commandments are about something else, because Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And then in Hebrews, the Hebrew writer says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. So let me ask you this. Does it take more faith to be a Christian faithful, to be totally devoted to God now, or when you're seeing Paul do miracles? Now. Mm-hmm. That's why Jesus said, of all those born of women, there's been none greater born than John the Baptist. That means David, it means Daniel, it means Abraham. No one better than John the Baptist because of his mission. Yeah. But he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Why? Because we have the opportunity. How awesome is that? Mm-hmm. We have the opportunity to give God even in greater measure than David could. Yeah. What he really wants. Real faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. We don't have miracles to prove it to us. We don't have. it takes faith to live for God in this secular culture.
Yeah.
And so I've heard people say, I just want to meet Paul and hear about maybe Paul wants to meet you.
Right, and that's such a foreign concept to the average 21st century Christian, because we view ourselves, because again, and it goes back to everything we talked about, how we gloss over the humanity of it, and because we put people on such a high pedestal when we probably shouldn't, we get into this mindset of why on earth would somebody like Paul, who did the great things that Paul did, or somebody like Moses, or somebody like, that's what we started this because I was sitting in a class one time who he was super excited to get to heaven and watch a recount of the parting of the Red Sea and have Moses in the back of the room like narrate it for him. And that's kind of how we started on this trail of, how Moses,
cool.
Right? It sounds really cool. I was like, but we miss the idea that, well, maybe Moses wants to meet us. And we can't fathom that because we view ourselves as, well, we haven't done anything special.
Yeah, I can kind of imagine trying to explain an iPhone to Moses.
Well, here's
kind of cool.
Right. Well, and here's the other part too. And this is like
a little bit. This on a stone.
Right.
What?
A little bit.
It's hard enough to explain it to my mother.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's like a little bit away from the point. Like, what happens when you get to heaven and you get to talk to Moses or Paul or whoever, and you've built this idea up in your head of how they're going to sound, and it's totally different than what you think. Like, it's, I don't know, that's just way off the point.
I've known people who've done great things, I think, for the Lord in their lives. I mean, my daddy, lots of stories in his life, but I remember in the 1970s, he preached for a church in the South, and they wanted to grow, so they sent him out to run the Joy Bus for VBS. So he went to the African American part of town, and he filled up that bus, brought it back, and the ladies at the church wouldn't put the babies in the cribs; they put them on the floor.
Holy goodness!
So my daddy got up in the pulpit and he preached to elders' wives, and they pulled him in and said, "You got to stop this because the biggest giver in the church and said you got to stop it." And he walked out not having a job and quit that day. And you know what? He didn't have God talking to him directly.
No, but he was talking.
He didn't have. So you know what? I think that Paul might want to have a conversation with my daddy, because Paul had direct revelation, direct inspiration. My dad didn't. Neither do you and I. So we do it only by one thing: faith.
Oh, yeah.
The one thing God values most.
Yeah, 100%. It always boils back down to money, doesn't it? I mean, that's why the Big Ten's playing football now. They weren't 2 weeks ago. Now they are. But anyway. Last thing we'll get at right here, because I think this is probably one of the most important things. We talk about the similarities. We talk about the differences. Has the head of the church ever changed?
This is also one of those yes and no questions.
This is pretty rhetorical, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Obviously, the nature of the Creator of the world has never changed. He is who He is. He is who He was, and He is who He's going to be. But that doesn't mean that not just the world, but sometimes the kingdom's perception of said Creator doesn't change from time to time. Now there's the problem. Is that we think that we can just change the nature of the triune God on a whim because of some cultural appropriation or something like that. So yes and no.
Yeah.
We change it, but that doesn't actually mean that the nature and the character of the Creator actually changes.
Right.
Yeah. Our idol changes for us.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
I mean, it's the world makes our idol for us, it seems like, and we can so easily be persuaded. I mean, as we always talk about, it's easy for us to plug in one idol for another instead of Jesus being right where He needs to be. We pull this idol right in front of him. He stands there where he should be, but we put stuff in front of him a lot of times. I feel like it's just, well, let me put this here. Jesus is right there. I promise He's going to stay there. Let me put this right here in front of Him real quick, just for today. Be fine, Well,
so, and I think a bigger thing that we do is it's a tricky concept, right? Mm-hmm. So what we try to do is we try to say, instead of putting something right in front of Jesus, we try to say, well, I'm going to put this on the same level as Jesus, and I'm going to prioritize these two things the same. And in actuality, you can't do that.
Mm.
Right? The Bible makes it very clear.
Well, actually, I think we do that, but we don't say that we do that.
Yeah.
So we like to say, I think we actually do that, but no one would ever admit.
But I mean, all that does is take us back to the first and second commandments, doesn't it? You have no other God before me, and you shall, make no image. And maybe the question, has a leader changed? No. But maybe the question is, how good have we gotten about finding something to replace that leader? Well, we have perfected that art.
Well, it shows your friendship with Jesus. And I say friendship because you look to John 15, where Jesus is talking about great love. I know man this lay down his life for his friends, but then he says, "You're my friends if you do what I say."
Well, so we don't ever view. I don't think we do a good job of viewing Jesus in that context. We view him as, and rightfully so, right? We view him as holy, superior, divine. We don't ever view that as like, I'm friends with Jesus.
This goes back to where we don't make enough hoopla about his humanity.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
we don't see him in his wholeness. In other words, we don't look at all aspects of it. Like the Bruins thing. Like today, a very common thing is kind of a social gospel idea. And indeed, Jesus said, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was in prison and you visited me. I mean, you can see that. That was a missing thing that needed to be emphasized. But then there are some who promote that so intensely as if that's the whole Jesus. But in John 6, there's the Jesus who refused to feed him. Jesus is complex. Scripture and faith is complex. If there's one issue that we've oversimplified. And we've been so formulaic in our Lockean approach to things that we like 5 steps of this and 5 acts of this and this, and not that those things aren't true individually.
We're very picky choosy, and we've done a great job of oversimplifying everything.
We want to package everything, and Jesus is difficult to package. Like for instance, it says in John 1, "The beginning was Word, Word was God, Word was God, and we beheld." His Word became flesh, and we beheld his glory, glory one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth. And we talk about people swinging on a pendulum. What always discourages me is sometimes you get churches that are all about grace, and sometimes you get other churches all about truth. But to be Jesus, and especially us, to be the church of Christ, to bear his name and represent him, he's more complex than either one of those. He's both. And you see that all the way through his ministry.
For sure. Well, there you have it, guys. 1st century, 21st century. There are some differences, but we're way more alike than I think we tend to believe. So, Carrie, Landon, want to thank you guys so much for coming down. Landon,
thank you.
Landon got a short. Really, you guys were both on relatively short notice calls, so it was awesome that we were able to pull this off.
Only about an hour or two notice.
That's great.
Yeah.
So
Landon
Landon loves traveling. That's just his thing. That's what he does. Anytime he gets a chance to come hang out with his old college buddies.
That's right.
A good car ride is good for the soul.
Absolutely. So, as always, this episode has been brought to you by the West Main Church of Christ because they purchased our equipment and we use their building.
Big shout out.
So shout out to them. Woo! Anyway, you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, Spotify, all those places where you get your podcast. Appreciate you guys coming in. Stick around. Look for our podcast next month. We'll come up with something to talk about. We always do.
That's right.
So anyway, till next time, guys. Appreciate it. We'll see you.